Hey everyone, welcome back to Generation Cult, a podcast about people who grew up in isolated, authoritarian groups, also known as cults, and how they adjusted to the rest of the world after they left their groups. I'm Deanna Levy, and with me today is an attorney named Carol Murchison. She did not grow up in a high-demand group, but she does represent victims of sexual violence, slavery, and human trafficking in spiritual communities and cult-like organizations. Some of her clients did grow up in these groups, and we're going to chat with Carol today about her work and the legal options available for people who have been harmed in cults. Carol, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Diana.
I'm really excited to have you here today because it's so important for people to know, as wonky and slow moving as our legal system is, that they do have options. Talk to me about the firm you work for and the kinds of clients that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So, interestingly enough, I practice in the United States, but the firm that I work with is in London. But we practice really transnationally in the UK, but also in the United States. And also, we have cases in Canada. So, it's a firm that's really a feminist firm. It is devoted to trying to bring legal options to both women and men, because we all know that men are also victims in some of these cult like organizations. And so we have a group of lawyers that practice solely in the area of sexual violence, sexual abuse, sexual assault in cult organizations.
I understand you've done a bunch of work recently with people who have claimed abuse in yoga and Buddhism based organizations, which actually might come as a surprise to some people because it feels like those tend to be known as more benign, even healing associations.
Yes, absolutely. Isn't that right? When I say that, people kind of look at me like, what? Yoga, Buddhism?
Yeah.
How is that a place where people are being sexually assaulted? But I think the thing that's interesting is that any organization, any religion can develop into that kind of high demand authoritarian group. It doesn't matter what the underlying religion is. And when that happens, at least in my experience, and I'm interested in whether that's the case for you as well, we see a lot of different abuses. So we see financial abuse, we see psychological abuse. The area that we work in is in sexual abuse. But in a certain way, it doesn't matter what the underlying religion is, whether it's Hindu or whether it's part of the yoga organizations, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Catholicism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where we have these high demand groups, very authoritarian, those are definitely some of the indicators that we see in the clients that come to us. Places where you can't have a dissenting opinion, where if you are being abused or feel you are being abused, there is no way to address it. Those are the kinds of things that we see that could certainly be considered to be cult or cult like organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. The underlying ideology is not usually the issue. I mean, sometimes it's a factor in some of the practices, but generally it has to do with somebody taking advantage of other people, basically, or like an authoritarian aspect. And yeah, that's so true that if you can't question, if you can't oppose anything, that is a huge red flag, whether it's a religious organization or otherwise.
Exactly. And when I go out and talk about this sometimes, and particularly to different religious groups, I often say something that is quite surprising to them. And I say, corporate America is doing better than religious America in many situations.
Hmm.
And that's such a surprising statement because we think that religions ought to be, as you said, benign, pure, looking out for the best interests of people. But since we began to see the kind of focus on sexual harassment in the workplace, which happens to be the area of the law that I practiced in before I began doing this work in spiritual communities, those organizations, they may not be happy for you to complain about sexual misconduct, but the law requires them to have a policy, to have a process for complaining. And we don't see that kind of oversight in religions. And it makes it much easier for people to be abused.
Yeah, that's so true. It seems like there's a certain attitude of, oh, I don't want to touch that. Like anybody from outside an organization with a religious organization, there's such a fear that somebody's going to claim religious persecution that if there's any problem, people appear to not want to get involved.
Well, certainly, we have the First Amendment, which gives us freedom of religion, and that's a good thing. But for me, sometimes people will say, well, what's a cult? I'm sure you're asked that question all the time.
Oh, yes. It's been a point of discussion on the show. Yes,
Exactly,
absolutely.
and it's kind of hard to say, isn't it? So, the thing that I say is that there are indicators of the kinds of organizations where this kind of abuse not only happens, because let's face it, it happens in all kinds of organizations. To
Yes.
me, it's what happens after it happens. Do you have a way to complain? Do you have a way to make things better? Are you retaliated against and drummed out of the organization because you're known as a complainer? We have a client who was accused of negative thinking because she complained about something that she saw happen to somebody else that was clearly, egregiously sexual misconduct. And it was like, no, we don't allow negative thinking.
Mm.
So, in these kinds of situations, it is difficult for people to complain, and they often just accept the things that are happening against them until maybe later, Diana, when they get out, when they leave.
Mhm.
So then most often, I would have to think about that, but I think maybe 100% of the time, our clients are people who have left. And after they have left and they have been out, they realize that what happened to them was not okay. And that's when they begin to look for some of the legal options, which are limited, but there are options for legal actions in these cases.
Yeah, and I know you can't speak in specifics, but I was hoping you could give me maybe a hypothetical or something general about someone who grew up in a cult, left, and would like to seek justice for harms that befell them in the group.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's often difficult for people who have grown up within the organization in which they were abused. And I say that because their whole community is there.
Mhm.
They have left, but they've left behind an enormous part of their life. And so the first thing that we see, it is very, very difficult for people to come to grips with that. But many people do. And so hypothetically, let's say we have a woman who has grown up in a cult. Maybe her parents entered the cult and therefore she was born into it. And then she is sexually assaulted, maybe raped, some kind of sexual misconduct that happens. And the response is the leader is all powerful. The leader knows what's best for you. If the leader does something and you think that it's wrong, it's because you have an error in your thinking.
Mhm.
That's the kind of response that comes back. I've several clients who received this message, accepted that message, except that time went by and it didn't really sit well with them. Something in them, because they were not living in an insular situation in the sense that they were not in an ashram or a commune. And so they have contact, limited, but some contact with people in the outside world. And somehow or another, it begins to dawn on people that this isn't right. And sometimes they then leave and seek legal options. Sometimes they try to resolve it again within the organization. But in some of the cases that we have, people have left and then they've come to us and they have said, I'm not getting any accountability, any justice from the organization itself. So I've talked to people, and the answer is, but this is the leader. he's the leader. Even people who are somewhat sympathetic, perhaps within the organization, may say, yeah, but there's nothing we can do because he's the leader. He's all powerful, he's all knowing. And I mean, literally, you can see there isn't anything. The whole organization is built upon that premise. And so, in those cases, we try to assess whether we can overcome the obstacles that the legal system puts in the way of these claims. And sometimes we can bring a claim, and sometimes we can't.
Hmm. And so, what types of litigation have been successful in the past?
Well, interestingly enough, there is litigation that's successful. Part of the problem with the legal system, inherent in the legal system, is we don't always know the cases that are successful because they may settle.
Hmm.
So the legal process, I think of it sometimes like a highway. So we're on a highway and we're going down the road and we file a claim and we continue. And when we file the claim, sometimes even before we file the claim, there is an opportunity for that claim to be settled. Now, a word of distinction between the civil justice system and the criminal justice system, right? We have two paths, maybe two highways. We're on the civil highway, and that is a highway in which money and sometimes change are really the only issues or outcomes that we can look for. The criminal justice system, the outcome is that maybe people will go to jail. So jail is not an option in the civil justice system, but money is. Lots of times people say, well, I don't want money. I don't want to be seen as doing this for money. But the reality is that healing from some of the circumstances that people have had to endure requires money. And so we always tell people, if you get the money, you can do anything you want with it. You could give it back to them if you wanted. You could start a nonprofit. You could help other women. You could pay for your therapy. So that's the civil justice system. So we're on this road of the civil justice system. We may settle before we even file a claim. Lots of times we send a letter and we say, hey, we think that a lot of things have gone wrong here and you really ought to pay attention to this. Maybe you'd like to talk about it. Sometimes people refuse, and then we file a claim, and then the civil justice process proceeds. And at any point in the process along that highway, there are exit ramps in which we may win or we may lose. If we win at a certain point, the organization may want to settle or not. Then we proceed and we go all the way up to and through trial with the possibility of settling. Now, why do I say that? Because when we settle, you and I, we don't know about that necessarily, because non-disclosure agreements are still being used in many states. And if the survivor is not able to speak about what happened, then you and I may not know about it. That's all by way of saying that I don't know all the successful suits, but I do know of a number of successful suits that have been either settled or tried, in which the victim has been victorious over the organization. And I know one of the things that I want to talk about today for the listeners of your podcast is some of the ways that different laws are being used to aid survivors of these kinds of organizations.
Yes, please go ahead.
So one of the kind of straightforward laws that protects people in any kind of an organization is being sexually assaulted. And so sexual assault laws are both criminal and civil, and we bring civil rape charges or civil sexual assault charges. And that's straightforward. But there are other laws that are being used that I'm positive that none of us would think about particularly as being of benefit in a situation where you're in a high demand authoritarian group and you are sexually assaulted. And one of those laws is the human trafficking federal law. So people say, and believe me, until I started reading the case law on this, I thought the same thing. But human trafficking, I think of it as a lot of women that you bring across the border, maybe from Mexico,
Mhm.
the Central American countries into the United States, or you're trafficking people from one state to another.
Yeah.
It's not really what that law is, interestingly enough. It is really where a perpetrator recruits or entices by force, fraud, or coercion. And that force, fraud, or coercion causes the victim to engage in a commercial sex act.
Mhm.
Now, if I pull that apart, oh, and by the way, it has to affect interstate commerce.
Mm.
That's where the word trafficking comes from. But
Okay.
in reality, the interstate commerce part of it is very, very tiny. So I want to give you an example.
Please. Yes.
It can be as small as having people come to your cult like organization from another state.
Mm.
It can be as small as advertising. It can be as small as potentially using the internet or buying a cell phone online. So, interstate commerce part of it is so small that the way that I think of it is don't worry about that. The lawyers are going to figure out that there's certainly some way that a group engaged in interstate commerce. So that leaves us with a person, let's say a leader, a guru, a swami, who causes someone to engage in a sex act by force. Now, that we know what that is, that's like rape, but it can also be by fraud or coercion. So, here are some of the fraudulent statements that I see in some of the human trafficking cases that have already been tried successfully. You will become more enlightened if you have sex with me. It's never quite put in that straightforward a way, but we have a case in which the survivor was told these practices, and I'm putting practices in kind of irony quotes, these practices,
Yeah.
right? They are necessary for your enlightenment and for you to progress upon your spiritual path. That is fraud.
Mm.
At least that's the argument that we are making in a case. Coercion, it could be in addition to some kind of promises of spiritual development, of spiritual progression, of progression within the organization. You'll become like my right hand person. You'll become a better teacher. There's a case in which a young woman wanted to become a prophet within the organization. And to do so, she had to endure a tremendous amount of sexual abuse. That's human
Mm.
trafficking. And so I see it as, we're not quite there. This is not a well developed use of that law. We're not quite there. But we see the applicability. And when Congress wrote the law, by the way, they intended it for to be used, to be construed, as they said, liberally. So the first time that I saw it was in Harvey Weinstein.
Mm.
So if we look at that as an example, it's pretty interesting. Those cases have been successful. What they said is that he caused his victims to engage in a sex act by fraud and coercion. And what he said is, I'm going to get you in front of big producers,
Mhm.
help your acting career. Well, we can translate that quite easily into a lot of high demand groups. You'll be safer here. We see that you should stay here and be in this sexual relationship with me, with the leader, because we're in an ashram and you don't want to go out into the outside world. I'm going to take care of you here.
Mhm.
That's a kind of fraud or coercion.
Hmm.
And so we're just beginning to see the tip of the iceberg on these kinds of cases. But it's important for people to understand that there are possibilities for this out there.
I can imagine though that that can be kind of hard to prove, when somebody says, I was coerced into this, it can become kind of a he said, she said situation.
Yes. Here's the thing. Often it happens to more than one woman,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So we have a case in which we have 4 women and, the kind of modus operandi is the same. I remember when I was telling somebody this morning, I remember when the Harvey Weinstein cases or the kind of when people were coming forward about him, that on news one night, someone interviewed a prosecutor, and he said, when I see 3 women who don't know one another, but that they have the same kinds of stories,
Yes.
and I know that there's truth there somewhere. There's a pattern. And so we can rely on a pattern, particularly when we can show that people didn't have the possibility of kind of talking together and, changing their stories. The other thing is we believe these stories. We have too many women who come forward to us for us to think that there's some great benefit for women who have been abused like this to come forward and go through what is not easy, which is the legal system.
Yeah.
People don't do it to get money. And there's just a sense that the evidence is there and that there is evidence. And even if it is he said, she said, the other side, the organization is facing a risk by going to trial, and they often settle
Hmm.
and they often give money to the individual who's come forward.
Okay. This might seem like an obvious statement, but I feel like since all of the Harvey Weinstein stuff, since Me Too, there has been a sort of shift where, I don't know, people are more open to listening to victims. Is that something that, you've noticed as well?
I do notice it as well. And I think that the impact that that has on the legal system is that if you do go to trial, and most of these do not, by the way, there are some statistics, some people say, somewhere between 90 to 99% of these kinds of cases don't actually go to trial. But even when they go to trial, what you have to realize is that a jury has also shifted. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Those people on the jury, they have seen Harvey Weinstein, they've seen the Me Too movement, and they have a shift in their thinking, or at least there's the possibility of that. And so I think it has the possibility of an effect in that way on the legal system.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
They know what they're doing is wrong. And that's why they keep it a secret. That's why they hide it. It's hidden.
They were 5 hours grilling and grilling and grilling. I was exhausted emotionally, spiritually, and I was thinking about my dead baby.
Then you would have said, oh, don't
right.
listen to them. Satan's talking to you, is trying to take you away from the community, from God and Yeshua.
Hi, I'm Tim Elliott, an author and journalist. I first wrote about a religious sect called the 12 Tribes in 2007, and the story has only got stranger from there. Take a listen to our new podcast, Inside the Tribe.
So, why should someone go to the courts? What good does it do the person? What good does it do society at large? Like, why put yourself through it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in the civil justice system, it's very different than the criminal justice system. So, I want to say specifically that I'm talking about, again, the civil side of our justice system. Why should someone do it? Well, I see people, often women, whose lives have been upended, whose lives have been they have been harmed. Let's just say all kinds of harm, psychological harm, sometimes physical harm. It's unimaginable some of the terrible, terrible things that are being done in the name of some or another kind of religion, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or yoga, or just some kind of cultic group that has its own, kind of religion going. It's
Mhm.
impossible for me to describe some of the physical abuse and sexual abuse that people have gone through. You don't come out of that well. You don't come out of that healthy. You need help to get healthy, and that help often costs money, and you don't come out with money. That's the thing. People who have gone into ashrams and given themselves to selfless service for 5 years no longer have any money. They can't get an apartment, they don't have credit, they don't have a bank account,
Yeah.
and they've been really, in a certain way, slaves. At least they have been involved in forced labor, which, by the way, is another claim that we're starting to see less successfully, but also sometimes used in these situations. So when you come out of a high demand group, and let's say that you've been born into that group, that's your community, you are starting your life all over again. And that is not an easy task.
Yeah.
You deserve reparations for the harm that has been done to you. So that's kind of my pitch, if you will, on the personal level. I have a lot of clients, and I have a lot of would be clients that don't feel that they're strong enough yet, but if they had the money for therapy, they might be able to. So that's one thing. That's externally. Internally, what I see, and of course, I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, I'm a lawyer, but what I see is that these high demand groups have taken people's agency and their voices away from them. If you can't complain, if you can't point out things that are harming you, your voice is gone. Even more than that, what I see is women who have been silenced and gaslit because they have tried to speak up about what they see as wrongs. So voice has been taken away. And one of the kind of internal things that I think that can happen for people who engage in the process is that they get their voice back. They get a lawyer. This is not the case in the criminal justice system because you don't have your own lawyer. But in the civil justice system, I act, and the people who work with me, we act as voices. We tell the stories. And for many people, that is a very healing process to know that people believe in you, to know that people are working for you, to believe that some good, and this is another kind of possibility, is that you may have taken back your power to put out of business somebody who is using their power against other people.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're going to keep doing it
Yeah.
if they get away with it. Yeah.
Listen, that is absolutely the case. We have seen cases that have been exposed 25 years ago, more than, now that I'm thinking about it, 35 years ago, and the organizations are still operating.
Mm-hmm.
So for many, the legal system is, the place of last resort. They've tried a lot of other things. They've tried to get media attention, or they have gotten media attention, but nothing has happened.
Yeah. I've heard complaints about that from guests who have been on the show. In some cases, even the FBI has gotten involved, but just nothing came of it.
Exactly. It is a very high threshold. If I can move to that other highway that I was talking about before, which is the criminal justice system, it's a very high bar to actually get into that system. So you have to go to the police and make a police report. I have heard endless stories of women who have gone to the police and the police have said, well, yeah, but you consented.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, no, no, just no. If you're in a situation where you have no other choices, you have no money, you have no bank account, you have no way to get out, you did not consent.
Yeah, that's not a free choice.
No, it isn't a free choice. But in the criminal justice system, we have to remember before we're too critical of them that the burden is beyond a reasonable doubt. So you go to the police, you either get shut down right there, or maybe the police investigate. And then they pass it on to a district attorney who has to decide whether there is probable cause. Then you have to pass that barrier. Then you have to decide whether they're actually going to take it to trial. Then maybe they're going to seek a plea agreement because the case isn't so strong. So there's a lot of barriers there before you get to the end. And what I always think of in my mind is the woman who came forward against the what is called the Stanford swimmer case. Do you
Yes.
remember, Diane?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There's a woman who went through all of the barriers. She jumped over all of those hurdles, and she got to the end, and she got to the end of the trial. And then the judge said, well, I'm not going to put him in jail because it's going to ruin his future.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I just have to say, damn, that's tough. That is really hard. It's not that appealing. And the civil justice system has a lot of things wrong with it. One is that the laws don't allow us endless time in the United States to bring forward claims.
Mm-hmm.
These time limitations are called statutes of limitations.
Yes.
And they are often different for children than for adults, but they're never long enough. They're never long enough for a person who has been traumatized. Let's take again the example that you raised in the beginning of the person who's been born into a high demand authoritarian group. When they leave, they have lost so much. The trauma of losing, the trauma of being violated, it takes time to process that trauma.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of thing that people walk out and they say, wow, I'm just going to go right on over to a lawyer and talk to that person about bringing a civil lawsuit. I have people that it's taken 10 years to understand that they were actually raped.
Yeah. People tend to feel like, oh, did I do something? How was this my fault for whatever reason?
Right.
And so, yeah, I know many people who didn't even process what happened to them until at least a decade later. And then at that point, what do you do?
Yes. Right, exactly. Well, what I would say is things are changing. And I would say that, for example, as an example of this kind of change, in Canada, within the last, I don't know, I would say 7 or 8 years, all of the Canadian provinces have dropped the statute of limitations completely
Oh, that's great.
so that there is no time limit. So if it takes you 10 years before somebody says to you, you know what? That wasn't a spiritual practice. That was rape. You've got time.
Mm.
Now, human trafficking statute of limitations is 10 years. I don't think that's long enough, but it's longer than a lot of the states. Another thing that I would say is that if you were abused as a child, as a minor, then oftentimes the statutes of limitations are longer.
That's good, because how is a kid gonna know at the
Right.
time? Sometimes you don't know that what's happening to you is a crime.
Of course you don't. You don't even have a name for it.
Yeah.
And so I personally believe that the same thing that we're saying about children and sexual assault is exactly the same for adults and sexual assault, particularly when these things happen in a spiritual community. I think of it like this. If you go to the doctor and the doctor is doing a gynecological exam, you expect the doctor to do a certain amount of touching. The context is important, right?
Mhm.
If you were attacked in an alley by a stranger who did the same thing to you, you would know that it was rape or it was sexual assault.
Yeah, that's straightforward.
But it's not straightforward when it's your spiritual leader, it's your religious leader, it's your cult leader. It's not straightforward.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the civil justice system needs more time and the statute of limitations, but the advantages of it are that you have your own attorneys. The attorneys generally, this is the way we work, and I think most lawyers, no matter what lawyers that are operating in this space, are generally not charging upfront.
Hmm.
So that survivor who doesn't have any money doesn't put out any money because lawyers who do these kinds of claims generally operate on what is called as a contingency fee. It's a no win, no pay. So the law firm takes the risk. If the law firm takes your case, it's because we believe in it and we believe that you will get a settlement.
Mm-hmm.
We're not always right.
Yeah.
We have skin in the game, so to speak. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's options.
Right.
That's so important. I was hoping you could talk to me about the legal concept of undue influence as opposed to tackling these cases from the perspective of belief systems. I felt like that was a really important way to approach these sorts of cases.
Yes. You know, there is an article that is in, I think it's one of the ICSA journals, and that is for your listeners, the International Cultic Studies Association. They have resources there, and I think they have a lot of things to offer. So I'm going to send you, and maybe you can post it. Is that possible?
Yeah.
This is an article about a case, a legal case of undue influence, and it was a case in which a man who had been in a cult, and the cult was charging him money to live. And this is very common in my understanding. I have another potential case in which this may be also an issue. People are being charged to live there. They work there. They get paid very little. They're in a kind of a debt situation all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they are owing the ashram or the commune or whatever it is for their rent and for their food. And he left, and they sued him for the money that he owed. And he got a lawyer, and the lawyer brought a claim of undue influence. And they were successful. And in my recollection, he won $1 million.
Oh, good for him.
So for maybe psychological abuse, maybe financial abuse, there is this possibility of showing the undue influence that was exerted. In other words, almost like the human trafficking claim, the coercion that was placed on the members of the cult in order to support the leader.
Okay. So how does that differ from going after a group and focusing on their practices or blaming it on their beliefs?
Right, because that's the downfall right there.
Yeah.
We are allowed to have religious practices, right?
Yeah.
So there have been a number of cases against the Church of Scientology.
Yes.
Of forced labor are ones that I'm aware of, and there are probably others, in which they were not successful because the court said these are the practices and the beliefs of this church. So the article that I'm going to send to you, in that article, the lawyer discusses how he stayed away from religious beliefs. And for example, in our practice, we stay away from religious beliefs and we focus on what is illegal. That is sexually assaulting people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you shouldn't do that.
So, right, exactly. You know, you may say that's your religious belief, but that doesn't trump the law. But we don't consider ourselves as attacking religion because, of course, that's ridiculous. If we're talking about Buddhism, the teachings, as in so many circumstances, have a tremendous amount to offer.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems like as human beings, when we get involved in it and we get interpreting it and we have a lot of power in which to do whatever we want to do with those interpretations, we run into trouble. So yeah, we can't really attack the beliefs. We have to attack the acts and the behavior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I have to ask, if somebody wants to go down the legal road after being in a group, what type of downsides, and I know we already covered this to a certain extent, but what should they be prepared for?
Yes. Well, I think the number one thing probably is, for a lot of people, reliving the behavior, reliving the incidences is very triggering for people. And it's uncomfortable and unpleasant and frightening, quite frankly. And so we always hope and we recommend that our clients are in therapy and they have a safe place where they can go and work through all of this. But That isn't always the case. And even when people are in therapy, if we're moving against that clock, that ticking clock of the statute of limitations, then there may not be time for people to heal to the point that where they need to be. Thinking about and working through and having to tell people what happened to you, it can be extremely difficult. So I think of that as probably the primary barrier to entering into civil litigation, because it happens right up front. You can't, as you can imagine, you can't say to the lawyers, I don't want to tell you about what happened to me because it's very painful. So just take my word for it. It was bad.
Yeah.
Right? We have to know exactly what happened. We have to know whether there was force. We have to know whether there was fraud. We have to know whether there was coercion. We don't expect our clients to come in and use those words. We expect our clients to say, well, what happened was, and then they may tell us the story, and we see the fraud. We see the coercion, but they have to relive it for us. And we try to make it as comfortable as possible, but it's still hard.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I have people on my show who I ask many questions about all of their experiences, and I know it can be triggering. I'm aware of that.
Yes.
But at the same time, when somebody's telling their story and saying, this is what happened to me, you kind of got to get into specifics to make people understand.
Yes.
So,
yes,
as difficult as it is.
Indeed. And sometimes there are people who find that empowering.
Yeah.
So it's not everybody, but for some people, everybody is walking their own path of healing from these things. So for some people, they're nervous. They may cry. That is fine. We always tell people, if you need to take a break, if we need to stop, if we need to, hang up, because we're often doing this via Zoom, if we need to do it another day, all of that is fine. But we're going to have the details. And sometimes people are like, wow, I'm really glad that I was able to tell you my story. So it's not a disadvantage for everyone. For some people, they're ready, they're at that point, and they feel empowered by being able to say what happened to them. And it kind of breaks a barrier then. But again, for others, it's very hard.
Yeah. How did you get involved in this type of work?
Well, I practiced law in large law firms. I advised corporate clients on how to make the best workplace possible, to be free of discrimination based on, race and color and age and gender and all of those things. And I did investigations. So if you can imagine in a corporation where there's an HR department, somebody makes a complaint about something, then sometimes I would get a call from a client and say, would you come in and kind of look into this and see if this is correct or not, if what this person is saying? It kind of goes back to what I said earlier. That's why I think corporate America is doing better than religious America, because they know they're in trouble.
Yeah, there's more set rules, more clarity.
Yes. And legal liability. And because they're in business, they often have either inside or outside lawyers. And so they know that there's a danger for them if they don't do the right thing. I never think that necessarily corporations are doing these things out of the goodness of their hearts, but it doesn't really matter in a certain way.
Yeah.
They're doing it. So I would go in and I would investigate. And I liked investigating a lot. And then eventually I retired and I continued to do a certain amount of work, including investigations. And so when Harvey Weinstein, when that news broke, I was doing a lot of investigations and really enjoying working in that particular role. And so about a year after Harvey Weinstein, when the kind of Me Too movement hit the sphere of spiritual communities, I volunteered to do an investigation for a woman who was alleging that there was a lot of sexual misconduct in the Buddhist community that she was born into. And so I think that was a particularly instructive situation where she was in this community, her parents were in this community, all of her friends, all of her life, everything she believed in was in this community. But she knew that children and women, adults and men, by the way, were being sexually assaulted. And when she brought this to the community itself, there was a lot of silencing and gaslighting. And so she decided that she was going to take on a project for a year of asking people to come forward to her and tell their stories. And I volunteered because the organization had shut her down. I volunteered to do an investigation because that was like, that's what I knew.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
was the only tool that I knew. And so I did an investigation, and eventually about 7 or 8 women came forward. They had credible, solid allegations against the leader of the group. And there was a lot of press. It was in the New York Times, it was in a lot of newspapers, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation did a podcast on it. It was like your reaction in the beginning. Gee, we don't think of Buddhists that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of interest in that. And then while I was still involved with that, another woman came forward and she said, I have 5 women who have been assaulted by a particular teacher in another Buddhist organization. Would you help them? And so for about 4 years, I had my own little pro bono practice of trying to investigate and dig up the evidence. So it was, you said before, the kind of he said, she said thing.
Mhm.
What I tried to do was to corroborate their claims, to show that there was a pattern, to be the one person who knew everybody's story so that I could find the places where they intersected, and to show then people within the community, the boards of directors of these communities, that these claims were credible, that they weren't just, what do they think? That people are crazy, you're a complainer, you're too sensitive.
You just want attention. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You're a money grubbing,
Mhm.
whatever. All of those things that I could show people that that was not the case. I would do the same thing as I did in corporate America, and people would say, oh my golly, we've got to resolve this.
Yeah.
But what I found was that religious America had no interest in resolving it
Mhm.
because they don't understand the liability, or they don't want to, or they live within their own little bubble where they believe that the law that they're abiding by is the only law. Simply not true. And so I started thinking that I needed to get these cases into litigation, these ones that I had worked on for years and tried to make change, and nothing had happened. And I had another situation in where I met a woman whose name is Anne Oliverius, and she runs this law firm in London. She's a fierce fighter for women's rights. And we have men, but most of the abuse cases that we have, just statistically speaking, are women. And I said to her, Anne, would you take these cases? And she looked at them and she assessed them and she took them. And then ultimately, after working with them for a while, she said, we need you to come on board. And I took a job in London, so it's like the ultimate crazy move on my part. But we're bringing lawsuits because we need to be able to show religious America, and in this case, Canada as well, and any other countries that have a civil justice system that is based on the law that says that you cannot sexually assault people, then in all of those places, these organizations need to know that this kind of behavior will not go unpunished.
Mhm. And so even though your firm is based in London, these cases can be brought in the US, in Canada. They can be brought
Yes.
outside. That's good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because, yes, all of the cases that I have, for example, are in the United States and Canada.
Okay. And what's the best way for someone to reach you or your firm?
Well, anyone can reach out to me. You'll have my email address, but I'll say it right here if you'd like me to
Sure.
and spell it out.
Yeah.
It's C for Carol, so C Murchison, and Murchison is Merchas, like Sam, IN like Nancy. So C Murchison at mcolaw.com. And so you have only to email me. And what we do, just so people know, is that we set up a time for the person who's reaching out to us to speak with us and to basically to tell their story. And then we kind of go away and we research and we investigate whether we have a claim. And then we get back to people and we help them assess their options. So we try to see what is the thing that's going to help you. And if it's civil litigation and we're not able to do that because of the law, then if we have other options out there for people, we try to direct them toward those resources.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do. It's so helpful for people to know that they have actual solid options like this. Is there anything else that you'd like people to know?
I guess that I would like people to know that the most important thing is that they're walking the healing path, that they get into a support group, for example, or that they educate themselves on, as you are doing, to help people hear other people's stories and be educated about that what happened to them is not their fault.
Mm-hmm.
We're too focused on what we may think that the abused person did wrong, but it's never that person's fault. And so there are lots of ways that people can get to that healing. The civil litigation route is one of them. And for people for whom that resonates, our firm, you can go online, you can see that there are other firms as well. So if it feels like something that's right for you, don't hesitate to get some kind of an opinion. It doesn't cost anything, and it will help you understand whether that's an option for you or not.
That's really good advice. Well, thank you. And thanks so much for talking to me about all of this. I'm hoping it'll be really helpful for our listeners who have experienced anything similar to what we've been discussing.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving a medium for these voices and these stories to be heard. That is so important for people's healing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's the show for today. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting and informative. We'll be coming back soon with more episodes telling the personal stories of people who grew up in and left high-demand groups. If you like the show and want to support it, please check out our page on the Patreon website, where members can enjoy early access to episodes and bonus features for as little as $2 a month. Just go to patreon.com/generationcult. Generation Cult is hosted and produced by me, Deanna Levy, with original music by Leanne Dunn and opening and closing music by The Chaw. See you next time.